For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Shannon de Rehove. Researcher and analyst Professor Raymond Suttner joins me for Suttner's View, a weekly commentary on South Africa's political scene. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you.
The ANC's election campaign relates to the achievements of 20 years of democracy, which relates to the role of the ANC. How do you react to this?
I want to make, in my response, I want to make what may seem scholastic type remarks. But I think it's important to understand, is the ANC government the same as the ANC? When people like myself were involved in the struggle, what we had in mind was that the role of people who were active in promoting democracy would not be simply to vote, but we would have a continuing role in political life on a daily basis in various ways. Now, when negotiations came, negotiations were basically to negotiate constitutional structures of government. The ANC was the leading force in the elections, and since then has either governed alone or governed with others as the leading force. But what happened, which I think is important to understand, is that a distinction emerged between the ANC as organization and the ANC as government. The ANC as organization doesn't run government on a day-to-day basis. It's even open to question whether the ANC determines the policies of government. Now, what happened after 1994 is that government departments had to make decisions in a number of different ways. NUMSA says one should implement the Freedom Charter in full. Let's say the ANC was committed to the Freedom Charter and the Reconstruction and Development Program. All of these policies had to be translated into green papers, white papers, and into legislation. They had to go through certain processes. They had to be put in a particular form. And the process of doing that meant getting hold of people who had the technocratic expertise to do this. And I'm not sure, and I think this book by Mashile and Kobo suggests that the ANC was not ready to govern. Now, in some ways, I think the ANC was not adequately prepared to deal with implementation, with the type of civil service that was needed for transformation, with the technicalities of making legislation. And the result was that technocrats came to have quite a lot of power, and they needed to seek advice about various things, and the result would be a piece of legislation which people who may have voiced the idea in a rural area or in a slum in the urban areas would not recognize the legislation. So that I think we need to understand then that government, as Mandela used to say, government has to govern. Now, people like myself found this quite shocking at the time because we thought that the organization would drive the process of change, would determine what the state would do in general. I recognized that translating it into technical form could not be done by the organization, but we came to feel that there was some sort of autonomous force that the state and government had, which did not bear a close relationship to its constituency. You could see this particularly with GEAR. GEAR can be objected to on economic grounds, but in 1996, when GEAR was adopted, it was declared to be both government policy and ANC policy. And I was at that time on the National Executive, and in a meeting in Belleville, I questioned this process because I said, how can it be ANC policy when it has not passed through constitutional structures? Tito Mboweni, who was then a minister, said I'm talking nonsense, had been passed through structures. In fact, what he was referring to is that there is a socio-economic committee in the ANC, and they had been briefed. They had not been consulted, they'd just been briefed. And the same, I think, happened to COSATU. So it's an important question. I'm not sure that my expectations at the time could realistically have been met. So the question really is, what happens to the ANC as organization after it becomes the leading force in government? Does it only resurrect itself for election? So that's the question.
Now, there are a range of problems in contemporary South Africa. Do you think these could have been avoided?
You know, there are a number of ways of answering this. Jay Naidu today, for example, or yesterday and today, in the Daily Maverick and the Sunday Times, points to a crisis of leadership. But I'd like to tackle something else. There are some people on the left, people like Arundhati Roy, John Pilger, and Ronnie Kestrels have also suggested that some deals were made in the beginning, a sort of original sin, which set South Africa's democracy on a trajectory which made it impossible to address questions of inequality. It is suggested that the captains of industry spoke to Mandela and others, and Arundhati Roy suggests that they said to Mandela, you can be the leader, but we will decide what's going on. It's hard to believe that anyone could talk to Mandela like that, because Mandela, even if he thought it was good advice, was a very stubborn person, and he didn't easily take to anyone telling him what to do. And I think a lot of this revolves around the question of nationalization. When Mandela came out of jail, he declared that nationalization was a fundamental policy of the ANC, and there's no way that they could change this. And he changed his mind. Now, what I think people are doing is fetishizing nationalization as if the use of nationalization is a signifier of transformation. Now, long before Mandela came out of jail in the 1980s, people who were outside start to review the value of nationalization, and they drew conclusions from a number of countries, including the former communist-led states, and these conclusions raised questions about nationalization as an adequate means for ensuring a growth and developmental path. And consequently, already in 1988, the ANC produced its constitutional guidelines where it spoke about a mixed economy. So even before Mandela came out of jail, many people in the ANC and its alliance were starting to think through concepts like growth through redistribution, which is a Keynesian concept. But it is true, however, that over time the ANC made decisions which turned growth through redistribution to redistribution through growth, which means really trickle-down type of economics. But I still want to go back to the question of original sin, to a conspiracy, to a sellout, or what Ronnie Kestrels calls a Faustian pact. Now, I was in leadership at the time. I don't believe I've got anything to apologize for. If someone made a secret deal, I know nothing about it, so I cannot apologize. But what I believe is that even if there were some secret discussions, decisions were made along the way. Like here, it didn't happen in 1990, happened in 1996. The ANC faced a situation where the world had changed. It was a unipolar world, and it was a hostile world in terms of a fragile economy where the apartheid state had basically bankrupted the economy. So hard decisions had to be made. I believe some of these decisions, like removing tariffs, were wrong, and they destroyed the textile industry. But I do believe that they had to step back, reassure any forces who could destabilize the economy, either through withdrawal of investment or through armed resistance. For example, slowness on the land may have been justified because many of these farmers were heavily armed. So there's a lot of these things, and I think it's time we moved away from conspiracy theories and examined the decisions and the legacies of those decisions that we now have with us, and work out ways of moving towards a developmental path that can benefit all. Thank you.
Thank you, Raymond. That was Professor Raymond Suttner speaking about 20 years of democracy in South Africa.